I'm Mark Chapesky, Vice President, Program Development, Electricity Human Resources Canada. I work for an organization called EHRC, or Electricity, as I said, EHRC, Electricity Human Resources Canada. Sorry, this is very distracting. I'm here to talk about the labor of love with my colleague, Luisa da Silva from Iron and Earth.
Hi, everyone.
Yes, thank you. It is tricky to follow that discussion, I'll be honest. And when Luisa and I were discussing before the event how we would come at this, both of us felt that we can't speak from the voices of Indigenous people. However, what we can do is talk to you about what we as organizations have been doing to support the work that's come out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as a number of other initiatives that our organizations have taken on to further engage with Indigenous communities.
That was just making sure everybody's paying attention.
It's not because I had too much coffee, right? Everybody else heard that? Okay. To support the work of Indigenous communities, but also to advance the missions of our own organizations, which will only work if we continue to work with Indigenous communities. And so there is a context that we're going to talk about with regard to so I'm obviously from the electricity sector. We support a workforce of over 110,000 people. Oh, actually, can I have a clicker for the slide thing? I just realized I don't have that either. A workforce of over 110,000 people. And it's divided into the groups that you see in front of you there. So core electricity occupations, 27% of which are skilled trades. That's a big number, obviously. We need people to build things. Engineers, technicians, technologists, 15%. 9% are managers and supervisors, 6% information communication technology roles. And then the balance are corporate services, so everything from business development, marketing, communications, et cetera. So we need a lot of people to keep the lights on in Canada at the end of the day. And that is currently how we break it up. Now, as an organization, EHRC has actually been looking at what I call sort of the gray area for us as an organization. So historically, we've counted utilities. There's a lot of work now, as you all know, being in the decentralized energy community, happening behind the meter. So whether we're talking about electric vehicles or integration of smart technologies or battery storage or solar on a rooftop or whatever, as an organization, historically, we didn't count that because it was too small for us to figure it out. But it's having a big impact on the grid now. And so we're having to think about who is it we need to engage more with, and how are we counting those professionals, and what types of skills do they need in order to work within our sector. Now, before I go on, I do want to give Luisa an opportunity to introduce herself, because I have a habit of talking forever, as Zanuck knows. So, Luisa, do you want to introduce yourself and Iron and Earth specifically?
Thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. My name is Luisa da Silva. I'm the Executive Director at Iron and Earth. Iron and Earth is a nonprofit organization, and we're very much focused on community engagement and working with people across Canada that want to be working in the low-carbon economy, and we very much deliver programs that enable people and lower their barriers to be accessing this particular economy. We have been very fortunate to work with a lot of communities across Canada, and very happy to be here today to talk to you about that. Thanks, Mark.
Awesome. So to give some more context to what we're talking about with the industry, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So job growth in the sector over the previous 5 years, so ending in actually 2023, is at 12%. Total economy was at 7% within that same period of time. So we're almost double the growth in our industry, and it's particularly focused on those core occupations. So if I go back for a second, the core occupations being the engineers, skilled trades, technicians, technologists, et cetera, where we're really seeing a lot of growth. We don't have great data on renewable energy jobs. So the point that I just made earlier about how many people are working in this industry, I will have a report to talk about next year, Anouk, so future discussion, where we're actually tabulating total number of people working in the renewable energy industry, but Canada doesn't do a great job of this. So the best I can do is job openings. So we used a tool called Vicinity Jobs, which is an AI tool. It literally scrapes all the jobs posted on the internet in Canada for looking for keywords like solar, wind, energy storage, battery, et cetera. It strips out all the junk, so if there's duplicates on multiple job sites like Indeed, Monster, et cetera, and this is what we came up with. So because we're in BC, I thought I'd share some of the BC specific data. There has been an 1,100% growth in wind turbine technician jobs just in BC over the previous 5 years. 579% nationwide. And then PV, similar, you see huge job growth, and renewable energy, generally huge job growth. So we know that the industry is exploding, like it's really blowing up. Now, the other area that I want to call your attention to, so when we think about where are the jobs, I know a number of people have been asking me, like, where are people expected to be employed? ICT. So 5 years ago, you see like the 2018 numbers, or I guess almost 6 years ago now, the 2018 numbers suggest, we had a number of people working in the industry, obviously, in those spaces, but in the next iteration, so in 2022, look at the green bar. We've, in some cases, quadrupled or quintupled the total number of people working in those spaces. So those are things like cybersecurity specialists, information system specialists, computer network and web techs. I think we've got a computer science major looking for a job in here. Our industry needs you, so please apply somewhere. Software engineers, software developers, these are not typical roles you necessarily associate with this industry, but we need those people. Cybersecurity in particular, there are threats to our grid daily, and they are being combated by the workforce that we have in our sector, but we need more of those people. It's a great sector to work. We pay well. People last a long time. Wage growth is pretty good. Not as good over the last few years as it has been in the rest of the economy, but we actually pay better than the rest of the economy in almost all areas, with one glaring exception, and that's information communication technology. Which is, as you can see from the previous slide, kind of challenging. And when we talk about forecast, like where we're going, 2028, we need 28,000 workers if we're looking at a net zero scenario. Slightly less if we're on a current measure scenario, but that's driven by population growth, it's driven by data server deployments, it's driven by electrification of the economy, et cetera. So 28,000 workers, that's roughly 25% of the workforce today, and that's within 5 years. Going out to 2035 and 2050, we need 130,000 people in a net zero scenario by 2050, which is a lot. The green at the bottom indicates replacement. The blue at the top is expansion demand. And then the last thing, because I think this is where we were really going to get into it on the education side of things, this gives you a sense of, and Anouk, I really appreciated your discussion actually earlier on with regard to certification specifically. So when we talk about engineers, technicians, technologists, skilled trades, those are all designated roles within our industry. And I think there's an opportunity here to talk about prior learning, but also upskilling, and whether or not that's micro-credentials or whatever it happens to be. And Luisa, I know you have lots of thoughts on this, so why don't, with my long-winded beginning, why don't we kick it off?
Yeah, so when it comes to training, we see that there's a lot of people that are living in communities that may not necessarily have access to the training institutions with which this training would be received. There's also, if you look at the OECD countries, Canada is the country that is the most receptive to engaging in training, which sounds like a great thing, right? Because then that means that we're all very skilled and very trained. But what is the flip side of that? If you think about from the employer's perspective, it means that they're expecting people to come in trained. they're expecting people to come in as, fully formed and we can just slot you in somewhere. And that makes for a very difficult challenge for people who perhaps are living in areas that either don't have access to that training, or if we can just say it, this form of education is a colonial structure that doesn't acknowledge people's lived experiences and knowledge that they may bring that is outside of that structure. So one of the things that Canada needs to have is for employers to embrace training people when they come into their jobs. And we do see that in large employers. They have great graduate programs and they're willing to take that risk on. But when you're a smaller employer and money's tight, you may not have that ability to take that risk on. So a lot of that de-risking needs to come in the form of funding and whatnot. And we do see that as a request in the communities that we work in. We recently did a project with the Métis Nation of Alberta, which is now called the Otipemisiwak Nation. We spoke with 7 different communities across Alberta, ranging from Medicine Hat, High Prairie, Calgary, Fort McMurray. And one of the things that did come from that is that they want training and support systems for transitioning workers.
And that actually aligns with some of the work that EHRC has done as well. So increasingly, and this is actually a bit of credit to the federal government here, increasingly we are now, as an organization, able to offer more than a traditional financial support to an employer for hiring of Indigenous participants. We're now able to offer what we have sort of colloquially referred to as wraparound supports. So if, for example, an Indigenous participant is experiencing barriers that are related to travel to and from a location, or they're going to be away from home and they have caregiving responsibilities, or they need to be renting an accommodation while they're on site for training, we were, through some of our previous programs, were able to fund a part of that, or at least subsidize a part of that, which allows that Indigenous participant to be placed in our sector, in our industry, where they otherwise might have been barriered from joining for any one of those reasons. And it's just the recognition of that is highly important if you're looking to engage with Indigenous communities, that there are barriers that they experience. We're doing a body of research right now at EHRC looking at what are the barriers in rural and remote communities, specifically Indigenous communities. And one of the first things through the environmental scan that's come out before we even got to the interviews of Indigenous participants and energy planners in remote communities and that sort of thing has been that, like looking, and this is why I'm bringing this up, looking at this slide. So if you look at this slide, you've got bachelor's degree or above. Look at the percentage of people in our industry that have a bachelor's degree, or the percentage that have post-sec trades certificate or diploma, or some post-secondary education. That graph is really high across occupational groups. If you don't have a high school in your community, or the nearest college or university to your community is literally thousands of kilometers away, you are barriered from access to this industry using this certification regime. It's tough. It will be really hard to get into this industry unless there are supports in place to help folks through that journey. One of the things that I know, Louisa, you've been working on and you've mentioned is finding ways to, first of all, recognize previous skills and learning, but then also upskill. And I know we've talked about micro-credentials before. Do you want to talk a little bit about that specifically? Because I know that can be a bit of a touchy subject, but I know you've got great thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's interesting how micro-credentials can polarize, because there's a group that doesn't like micro-credentials because it means that there's no standardization across it. But then there's the other side of that argument, which says, but micro-credentials may be the only way that somebody that doesn't have access to that highly structured environment can be gaining these skills. So at Iron and Earth, we do a lot of upskilling, we do a lot of training, but what we also do quite a lot of is people that never even considered themselves as perhaps coming into this industry, we give them those like first steps. We reduce those barriers for them, and we give them just a little bit of exposure, which is often all that's needed for somebody to suddenly realize, oh, I can be part of this story too. I can see myself in this narrative. And it breaks down those barriers, and then they can go pursue either further training, or they can join a union as they progress through their apprenticeships and whatnot. But it's those first initial steps that is really crucial, where somebody sees themselves as part of the solution, and that's something that right now is quite absent.
And I'm glad you brought up apprenticeship, because that's actually my next slide. Canada's got a problem. If you look at that graph, with the exception of 2021 there, the total number of registrations in apprenticeship has been going in exactly the wrong direction. So if we think about all of the building that we need to do, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about new nuclear reactors or solar farms or wind farms or any number of new technologies, transmission lines, distribution, et cetera, we need people to do that work. That work is mostly done in the build phase by folks with a registered Red Seal trade. So that bar, or that line, I should say, is going in exactly the wrong direction. The green represents the total electricity industry, so the folks that would fall into our core skilled trades. The dark blue is electricians, and then the light blue is welders. And I could have put a whole lot more on the graph, it just gets messy, but it gives you a sense of what we're talking about. Now, post-COVID, we've seen a bit of a bounce back. There have been more registrations, but the one thing that I don't have on the graph is completions. So completions of a Red Seal trade in Canada hover around 50%. In our industry, it's much higher. It's closer to 85%, but still, we're losing people for a variety of reasons. And unfortunately, more of those people fall into, more of those people recognize themselves as Indigenous, or as women, or as Black and racialized people. There's a much higher percentage of people who don't complete because of issues they're facing on their job sites. And so that's something that we have to address at some point. Did you want to comment further on this one, or should I move on?
Well, in terms of what we're seeing in communities, we very much see a lot of different factors that may not come into when you're initially thinking about, entering apprenticeships. But when people are thinking about affordability, then, going for that additional training is not going to be top of their mind. We see that communities are looking for economic diversification. They're looking for different industries to be coming into their communities. And the other flip side of that is that affordability is worsening their access to services. So they will have to go from the community that they're in to a different community just to access services. What I'm trying to point out is that although it doesn't sound entirely related when you think about these two things, the one underlies the other. These really are those barriers. When you can't, when you don't have your basics sorted out, you will fall into just taking what you have. You'll work at the industry that's probably in your local community, and you won't even think of entering something else.
Yeah, I think, and that tracks with some of our own work as well. And I think what I'm going to do next is I'm going to move on to, I'm noticing the time, move on to talk about age. So the graph in front of you, dark blue represents British Columbia, light blue represents Canada, so the numbers are a little different for each. But the numbers I want you to focus on are the under 25 cohort and the over 55 cohort. So let's take British Columbia, for example. 25% of people in our industry are about to retire. So they're just getting ready to walk off the job. Under 25, those who have just joined or are in the process of joining, make up only 7%. Does anybody see the challenge there? We're literally watching the most skilled and educated and trained workers walk out the door at almost 3 to 4 times the rate, depending on whether you're in BC or national numbers, of those that are entering under the age of 25. I have spoken to utilities across Canada, and many of them have been like, thank God it's not just me. Everybody is facing the same challenge, regardless of where you are. And we're not graduating enough folks into our sector, so those leaving the university engineering programs or the technician technologist programs in college or the skilled trades programs, we are not graduating enough of them into our industry to make up for that difference. That's a big problem. And at the same time, we're putting more demands on the industry than we've ever previously experienced, where we're seeing electrification. I think we're no longer using electrification of everything because we recognize that there are other zero or low carbon options for different sectors of the economy, but electrification is going to be a big part of getting to net zero. And so we're leaning on the industry more heavily than we ever have. And yet we're not bringing enough young people in. And I know Iron and Earth has done some great work in this area too. So Louisa, why don't you kick us off there too?
Well, everybody in this room must have heard of the Sustainable Jobs Act, and thank goodness that that finally has come into effect so that there can be some money going behind the transitioning that is needed, because exactly these numbers are speaking to not enough people coming into it, but we do have quite a lot of workers that are already quite skilled but either find themselves unemployed, underemployed, and they have a lot of the skills that are needed for the low carbon economy. So Canada's solution to the just transition is the Sustainable Jobs Act. If we contrast that with some countries that are progressive in the just transition space, we see, for example, Germany, when they phased out their coal workers, and a lot of those workers ended up working in the rail industry. The workers that were getting closer to retirement age, they were actually retired and the retirement was paid out. Because it would have been either more expensive or just not enough of a time horizon to transition them into a different industry. But what's really interesting is that over this past weekend, the European gas industry for the past year and a half has been in talks with the unions to be transitioning the gas workers and to be paying for this transition. It was under the Just Transition European framework that was basically designed to guarantee retraining so that people could go into this other sector. Well, why am I mentioning this? Because this past weekend they decided to pull the agreement. And they said that they won't be transitioning those workers, they won't be paying for it, but they're still very supportive of the just transition. This would have been for people that are working in offshore gas, in pipelines, storage facilities, home gas fitters. And these are some of the most progressive countries in this space. So I think that Canada has a big opportunity to be very much leading on how we transition workers. And both things can exist. You can both be working in the oil and gas industry, let's say during the winter, and you can be working in the low carbon and renewable industry in the summer. Right now we're at a point where we're developing and very much implementing these new technologies that are needed for the industry of the future. And the person that invented the light bulb worked by candlelight. You use your existing technologies to develop the technologies of the future. So we are very much in a crunch point, and we need an all-hands-on-deck approach exactly for these numbers that we're seeing. We're just not getting enough of that new pipeline coming in. If we wait for that to develop, it might be too late. So let's look at who we already have that is skilled and work with them on the retraining side.
Yeah, and EHRC has done some work on that same issue as well. We looked at, it was a pilot project. Unfortunately, it was only 18 months, but the idea was looking at workers in transition. So how do we transition workers from other sectors of the Canadian economy into the electricity sector specifically, whether that's renewable energy jobs or traditional electricity jobs in nuclear plants or in gas plants even, or in other sectors. So the next thing I'm gonna jump to is this slide, and I think this one is particularly indicative of where we're at as an industry from a representation perspective, and because we're focusing a little bit on Indigenous people here today. it's interesting to note that 5% of this industry is already Indigenous. And so when you look at the broader population of Canada, it is about 5%. It depends on the numbers you're referring to, but it's about 5% of the total sort of available workforce in Canada identifies as Indigenous. However, one of the things this slide also tells us is that they are overwhelmingly concentrated in the skilled trades. So we don't have folks or we don't have as many folks in the engineering technician technologist roles, the corporate services roles, the information communication technologies roles, and tellingly, the management and supervisory positions. That's a challenge for the industry. Because there is a lot that Indigenous people bring to the table besides the skills that we have traditionally recognized in our sector. And I do want to share a story of an Ontario company that was building a transmission line where they've taken a far more proactive approach to engagement with Indigenous people. I think we all know we're well beyond duty to consult. Like it's we're looking for equity partners. We are looking for, and by the way, when I say we, I mean the industry, but also Indigenous communities are looking to be partners in energy projects, not waiting for some company to come and talk to them. There's a great story of this company, a transmission company. So they were thinking about a transmission line, but credit to them, they went to the Indigenous community before they were even on the design paper. And they're like, look, we're thinking about a transmission line. It's likely going to impact your community. What do you think? And very interestingly, they're like, well, we need to bring in our hunters to the table and talk to them about where you're thinking about this. And they were largely bought in as a community, but it was the line where they were sort of thinking that it was a challenge. And so the hunters came in and said, well, that's a terrible idea. I wouldn't put the line there. Not because it's going to impact the hunting grounds necessarily, but because of the geologic formations along the line route. I would put it here instead. So even though this individual doesn't have an engineering background necessarily, he was able to reroute the line or give them a new path for the line that actually ended up saving that company millions of dollars without having to go through a whole geotechnical feasibility study. So obviously they still have to do that because of regulatory requirements and that sort of thing, but it made the whole process much easier because they didn't have to do it twice in that same sort of area. I share that story because sometimes when we think about engagement, and when we, I mean the colonial we think about, oh, it's something I have to do. There is real value that Indigenous people bring to the table and their communities bring to the table. And I think we need to start recognizing that value for what it is more than we do today. So I think we've painted a picture of sort of the challenge that we face as a workforce for the industry. And so obviously we sort of want to leave you on a bit of a more positive note. So where do people come from when we think about sort of new workforce? So intersectoral mobility, we've talked about workers in transition, so folks coming from other industries into ours. The most transferable typically are construction, oil and gas, and mining. There's a lot of competency and occupation transferability between those sectors. There are other sectors. We've done some interesting work on tourism and hospitality, for example, looking at folks that can come from tourism, hospitality into this industry. At first, that sounds like a bit of a crazy idea, but a lot of business development, a lot of marketing, a lot of customer service that is transferable into our industry. Interestingly, within the tourism industry, there's been a lot of work on energy efficiency done, and so there are folks that have highly skilled folks and technical expertise that also transfer into our industry. Don't tell tourism that I said that. They might not be super happy at Fairmont for bringing that up. Underrepresented groups. So this is a sector, as you saw from the previous slide, that we need to do a better job of engaging with underrepresented groups, but we have to be engaging with them young. And I can't help but call out the map next door. The idea behind that was actually to encourage youth in that sort of grade 6 to 8 age range, or grade range, to think about this as a sector of choice. The great thing about public schools in Canada is they are representative of the Canadian population today. So if we can engage kids while they're young in STEM, then we know that we can engage them in this industry. And so that map, that's what that's all about. 8,100 kids walked across that map last academic year, and we expect that there's going to be at least that many again. So one of the reasons we brought it here today is to just demonstrate the importance of tools like that to curriculum. So that takes me down to the school leavers and new immigrants. We have a bit of a challenge in Canada, and we don't talk about it much as an industry, but demographers do. 2 years ago, and forgive me men in the room, but demographers typically talk about women when we talk about population growth. For every woman in Canada, there were only 1.4 live births. For every woman in Canada, as of this most recent data, it's 1.23 or 1.26, I can't remember, but 1.2 for the sake of argument. In order to maintain your population as a country, we need to have 2.1 births per woman in society. Otherwise, we're not even replacing our current population. So we actually need immigrants, and we need immigration, because in order to continue to grow the economy, grow the GDP, et cetera, without productivity gains, which we all know we also need, we actually need immigrants to continue to grow our industry in particular. And Louisa, I know you have thoughts on both sides of this, so maybe you could jump in as well.
It's the stats, right? So we're facing, 80,000, I think that's the recent stat, of if we don't welcome immigrants in. And the only reason that we just narrowly avoided a recession was because of the immigration that we had last year. So it's absolutely critical. We see in the work that we do and the work that we do with the AHRC that the newcomers to Canada are bringing a wealth of skills, and a lot of the times it's our broken system of how we recognize the skills into the education and what we want people to bring forward. But we have a skilled population, and we have a need to be building out the low carbon economy. So these two things really make a lot of sense coming together, and we need to be able to make that easier.
Now, I have 30 seconds. Am I allowed to take one question from the floor? No, I'm not allowed to take one question. Wow, I'm getting the head shake. That's very, very serious. So maybe we'll close out just by saying, as an industry, we have a lot of work to do to achieve our 2050 objectives. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go, and we need to start thinking more creatively about how we recognize skills, whether they are from immigrants or from Indigenous communities that want to participate in the energy transition. And so Louisa and I will be here for the rest of the conference. The map will be next door until just after the last break of the day. So I encourage you to chat us up. We're happy to talk about more ideas about how we get there from a workforce perspective over the course of the next little while. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.